Welcome back to the Deep Dive. 72 hours ago, when we last spoke, we were tracking a geopolitical crisis hanging by a diplomatic thread.
A very thin thread.
And today, that thread it's just gone. It's entirely severed. What began as a terrifying high-stakes diplomatic standoff is now undeniably an active conflict. The entire landscape has fundamentally shifted.
Indeed. We have crossed a definitive line. We've moved from that, theoretical framework of looming aggression into what analysts are now officially labeling kinetic conflict.
And we should probably clarify what that means right up top.
Right. It means boots on the ground, projectiles flying, and active lethal force being used. But if you take one crucial lesson away from our deep dive today, it has to be this. This conflict is not a repeat of any previous major war. It's something new.
Absolutely. The core theme that just jumps out from all the source material we've aggregated is that this represents the first truly global-scale, comprehensive hybrid war. It's kinetic, yes, for sure. But the crucial insight, the one that will define how this whole thing plays out, is that the first shots fired were not ballistic missiles.
No.
They weren't hitting military targets. They were digital.
And that's our mission today. We are moving beyond that initial declaration of hostilities to really analyze the unfolding crisis. We're looking at it through the lens of its non-traditional elements. We need to understand the strategy behind these digital fronts, the paralyzing economic and informational fallout, what the sources are revealing about the strategic endgame.
Which seems to be a brutal high-stakes strategy of attrition.
Exactly. For you, our listener, this deep dive is really a shortcut to understanding how 21st century warfare fundamentally functions.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start where the conflict truly began. Not on a battlefield, but in the digital sphere. The sources are overwhelmingly clear on this point. Before any physical confrontation, before a single shot was fired in the traditional sense, the aggressor's strategy dictated a coordinated attack in the server rooms and network architecture of the West.
That's right.
So when we talk about kinetic conflict, we mean active, visible warfare.
Yeah.
Things blowing up. But that was strategically preceded by a massive, coordinated cyber offensive.
That's absolutely right. And this isn't, collateral damage or some kind of side skirmish. The digital front was the carefully planned opening salvo. It was designed to maximize shock and really paralysis, and the weapon of choice. It utilized a level of sophistication that was previously reserved for the highest stakes of international espionage.
And that weapon is the zero-day exploit.
The zero-day exploit.
For those who track this topic, a zero-day is almost mythological in its power. Can you drill down a bit on the technical concept for our listeners, just so we're all on the same page?
Certainly. A zero-day attack. So think of it this way. It exploits a vulnerability, a flaw in a piece of software. It could be an operating system like Windows or industrial control software or, network infrastructure. And the key is that the vendor, say a company like Microsoft or Siemens, has had literally 0 days to detect it or fix it.
So it's a hole that nobody on a defensive side even knows exists.
Exactly. It is an unpatched hole, a digital skeleton key that works instantly because the defense community has absolutely no countermeasure ready. It's the highest expression of offensive cyber capability.
The implication of using multiple complex 0 days all at once, which is what the intelligence reports are suggesting, is just immense.
It's staggering.
I mean, acquiring just one of these vulnerabilities on the black market can cost millions of dollars, and developing them internally, that requires a dedicated elite team working for months, if not years.
Absolutely. This isn't a group of hackers in a basement.
No, this confirms state-sponsored involvement. The sources are attributing this specifically to highly trained Iranian state-sponsored actors. And that means the preparation for this war was well underway while diplomats were still sitting at the table smiling for cameras.
Exactly right. The sophistication signals intent, but the chase of targets, that signals the strategy. And this is where it gets really interesting and frankly very cynical.
Because they didn't primarily target air defense radars or military communication links, did they? At least not at first.
No. They focus on what's called soft target disruption.
Why? Why that choice? Why would you spend an immense amount of capital and time developing these elite, digital weapons just to disrupt someone's daily commute, it seems? Inefficient compared to hitting, say, a vital naval command center.
And that's the brilliance and the cruelty of the strategy. The objective wasn't military destruction, it was psychological and logistical paralysis. The aggressor understands that destroying a tank results in, external political condemnation, but causing widespread panic in a city that erodes internal political will.
I see.
By attacking civilian infrastructure, they achieve a very high return on their investment with a much lower risk of an immediate, massive kinetic retaliation.
And the sources cite these incredibly specific, almost mundane impacts, which is precisely what makes them so powerful. We're talking about power grids flickering across parts of Europe. Not necessarily going dark forever, but just enough to create instability and fear.
Right. Massive denial of service attacks, hitting banking systems, collapsing online transfers, and critically making ATMs just stop working.
And traffic lights failing in high-density urban areas. You can just imagine the chaos.
When you look at those impacts together, you see the strategic goal very clearly. They utilize 0 days specifically against what are known as SCADA systems, that's supervisory control and data acquisition systems.
And these are?
These are the often legacy interconnected systems that manage critical industrial functions, things like water flow, gas pipelines, electrical distribution. These systems are often older, they're less secure, and crucially, they're managed by civilian agencies, not the military. So an enemy can essentially gain access to the nervous system of modern society without firing a single shot. That's a chilling thought.
It is. I mean, consider the immediate implication of those failures in, say, Munich or Manchester. If your bank card is suddenly unusable, if the transportation network grinds to a halt because of widespread signal failure, your immediate visceral concern shifts entirely.
Yeah, you're not thinking about military action thousands of miles away.
Not at all. You're demanding stability right here at home. And that disruption is the very essence of modern psychological warfare, or PSYOPs.
And it forces Western governments into an immediate fragmented response.
Yeah.
So instead of dedicating all their cyber defense assets to military intelligence gathering or, their own offensive preparations, they have to divert massive resources just to patch these old SCADA systems and restore basic banking functions.
It fragments their effort instantly. It puts them on the back foot from minute one.
The aim, then, is to create a sense of pervasive insecurity.
Exactly. The lingering questions. Will the electricity stay on? Can I feed my family if I can't access my savings? That level of sustained uncertainty is a powerful, corrosive agent. It works against national resolve. It's all calculated to erode public support for the war effort before major kinetic battles even begin. They are weaponizing our modern dependency on digital convenience.
But I wonder about the long-term political blowback. Does targeting civilian infrastructure with such clear malicious intent not eventually unite Western populations against them rather than divide them? Are they risking a rallying effect that might negate the psychological chaos?
That's a very valid strategic critique, and the sources suggest the aggressor is banking on the inherent short attention span of democratic politics.
The 24-hour news cycle.
Exactly. The immediate discomfort and the domestic financial costs are intended to fuel political division now. They are calculating that the pain of the blackout or your card not working is felt much more acutely than the abstract notion of foreign aggression. And there's another layer, attribution. While it's strong, it's harder to prove definitively for a 0-day exploit than it is for a missile launch. There's always this thin layer of deniability that slows down the full political mobilization. It creates just enough doubt.
Let's delve a little deeper into that operational aspect. How do these attacks actually manifest on a grid? Are we talking about simply shutting systems off, or is it something more insidious?
Well, in the case of the SCADA systems, the reports suggest a combination of highly targeted attacks and brute force denial of service, or DDoS attacks. The 0-day exploit allows access to the controller systems themselves.
So they're inside the control room, digitally speaking.
Precisely. That could let them cause localized short-duration failures, those flickering lights you mentioned, or manipulate traffic flow systems to create massive choke points in cities. The DDoS attacks, hitting the banks and the telecom firms, are much cruder. It's simply overwhelming the systems with data requests until they crash.
Like opening 1 million browser windows at once until the server just gives up.
That's a perfect analogy. The server overheats and quits.
So the message from this first part of our deep dive is stark. The front line is no longer defined by geography. It's not a trench in a field somewhere. It is inside the infrastructure you rely on every hour of every day.
Absolutely. And this level of immediate low-cost destabilization is what makes the conflict truly hybrid. It sets the stage for the rest of the global fallout, which immediately became apparent in the economic sphere.
Okay, so moving from the invisible digital front to the visible physical impact on global logistics.
Yeah.
We have to talk about the economic paralysis that hit almost instantly. Our sources confirm a geographical choke point that is now fully activated. It's become a strategic weapon. the Strait of Hormuz.
That critical waterway, which connects the Persian Gulf to the open ocean, it's effectively a no-go zone.
And the importance of that can't be overstated.
Not at all. The Strait of Hormuz is, by some estimates, the transit point for nearly a fifth of the world's total petroleum consumption. I mean, think about that. When you cut off or severely compromise such a vital artery for global trade, particularly for oil and gas, the financial consequence is immediate, devastating, and globally felt.
We've seen crises in the Strait before, sure, but the current status report suggests a full paralysis, not just a slowing down. And the key metric cited is a financial one. Insurance premiums for maritime shipping. They've reached exorbitant levels. Explain why this economic warfare is just as effective as a physical blockade.
It's the ultimate weapon of economic risk aversion. It's quite brilliant, in a way. To understand why, you have to look at the insurance market specifically, the war risk premiums charged by Lloyd's of London and similar syndicates.
So this is all about risk.
All about risk. A shipping company faces the prospect that its vessel, which could be worth hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars, might be hit by a mine, a missile, or an Iranian fast attack craft. The perceived risk becomes unquantifiable.
And the insurance companies price that unquantifiable risk in making the cost astronomical.
Precisely. The term exorbitant means unreasonably high, so high that it makes the underlying trade economically irrational. If the insurance premium for a single passage through the strait exceeds the profit margin on the cargo, the oil simply doesn't move.
So you haven't physically sunk a single ship.
Not one. But you've stopped the flow of trade just as effectively. It achieves the exact same military objective as a naval blockade, but you're using financial instruments rather than warships.
This highlights the deep preparation of the aggressor. They knew that by deploying low-cost threats, old mines, small patrol boats, just the threat of an attack, they could leverage the global financial system to inflict immense pain on their opponents without sustaining a massive military cost themselves.
It's a classic calculated asymmetric move, and there's more. The sources detail the logistical consequence. Because Hormuz is closed for all practical purposes, shippers have to reroute.
And there's really only one alternative for moving Middle Eastern oil to Europe or North America.
Right, the incredibly long haul around the Cape of Good Hope, essentially rounding the southern tip of Africa.
What does that mean in real terms? How much time and cost does that add to a journey?
Oh, it's huge. That rerouting adds roughly 10,000 to 12,000 nautical miles to the journey. For a massive oil tanker, that translates into at least 3 to 4 weeks of additional transit time.
Wow.
And that means exponentially higher fuel costs, massive delays in market delivery. This immediately tightens global supply, which drives up energy prices everywhere and contributes directly to the inflationary pressures that Western governments are already facing.
So it's an instant self-inflicted economic wound on the global economy, all designed to undermine domestic support for the war.
Correct. So you have economic warfare running parallel to kinetic action and cyber warfare. And all of this chaos, combined with the active fighting, produces that ancient concept of the fog of war.
But now it's amplified exponentially by the digital age. We are navigating a storm of disinformation.
The challenge of the information age is that the fog is now manufactured. It's made deliberately and pushed out algorithmically. The confusion is intentional. We see Tehran state media making these bold claims like sinking 3 Western destroyers,
While at the same time, Western command vehemently denies any capital losses at all.
And when two powerful entities present completely contradictory versions of reality, the truth itself becomes immediately suspect.
And both sides are actively engaged in this. In narrative control and the intentional spreading of false information, it's about achieving military or political objectives through perception, not just through firepower.
And you have to look at the specific tactics highlighted in the classified summaries. The sources point to the rapid circulation of deepfake videos
On platforms like TikTok and Telegram.
Exactly. And these aren't crude Photoshops anymore. These are highly convincing videos that purport to show enemy forces surrendering en masse, or far worse, documenting fabricated atrocities committed by the opposing side.
The insidious genius of deepfakes is their immediacy. They capitalize on the emotional urgency of social media. By the time a major news agency can verify, debunk, and widely communicate that a video is fake, the emotional impact, it's already done.
The demoralization of troops, the outrage of the enemy's civilian population, it has already spread globally, and it's impossible to retract. The damage is done in the first 30 minutes.
This is a deliberate strategy to degrade the opponent's internal cohesion.
No question. The purpose is clearly to demoralize enemy forces on the ground and to undermine public support for their leadership back home. It sows internal distrust. If a soldier sees a video and thinks his comrades are surrendering, his willingness to fight evaporates. If a citizen thinks their military is committing war crimes, their support for the entire campaign fractures.
This brings us to a key concept that really defines the current information landscape: obfuscation. It's not just about lying anymore, it's about blurring the line entirely.
That's the perfect word for it. To obfuscate means to render something obscure, unclear, or unintelligible. And the key insight for you, the listener right now, is that the primary goal of this propaganda campaign isn't necessarily to make you believe a specific lie like that 3 destroyers were sunk.
It's something else.
It is to confuse you so thoroughly by presenting so many plausible yet conflicting narratives that you simply stop believing the truth altogether. You give up.
That cynicism and paralysis, that inability to trust any established source, is exactly what the aggressor wants. If the public can't tell fact from fiction, they can't unify behind a clear political objective. And that makes it impossible to sustain the kind of unified war effort you need to counter an attrition strategy.
The sheer volume of conflicting data is a weapon in itself. Every skirmish, every casualty report, every policy statement has multiple competing official versions, and then dozens of algorithmically amplified, sensationalized versions on top of that. This information overload is designed to induce what you might call data fatigue,
where the average citizen just checks out. They retreat from the conflict entirely because it's too hard to follow.
Exactly. The ability to verify and authenticate facts becomes a resource that's scarcer than ammunition. And this informational chaos, it bleeds directly into the realm of international governance.
As the fighting began, the world looked to the international bodies designed to manage and contain conflicts of this scale, specifically the United Nations. But what the sources reveal is a complete and, frankly, a very predictable failure of consensus.
It was almost preordained.
The global institutions designed to prevent this exact type of conflict are proving spectacularly ineffective.
That's the perfect assessment. The emergency session of the United Nations Security Council, the UNSC, was convened, and the result was instantaneous and total gridlock. Now, for our audience, we don't need to define gridlock as just no progress. We need to understand why the institutional machinery failed so spectacularly.
Well, the Western powers, we're talking primarily the P3, the US, UK, and France, pushed for a really robust response, specifically a Chapter 7 resolution. Walk us through the weight of that request.
A Chapter 7 resolution is it's the UN Charter's nuclear options, so to speak. It is the formal mechanism for collective security. When the UNSC passes a Chapter 7 resolution, it's formally determining that a threat to peace, a breach of peace, or an act of aggression exists.
And it gives them teeth.
It gives them teeth. It authorizes measures up to and including the use of military force to restore international stability. Passing this resolution grants the maximum possible international legal legitimacy to any resulting military intervention. It transforms a unilateral action into a global, multilateral enforcement.
But the sources indicated the outcome before it even happened. This maximum leverage move was immediately rendered obsolete by the exercise of veto power.
Right. By permanent members implied strongly to be Russia and China, whose strategic interests are aligned with, or at least non-hostile toward, the aggressor.
This is where the post-World War II security architecture just reveals its fatal flaw, isn't it?
It is. The resulting impotence of the UN, its complete inability to take effective action, is directly attributable to the veto power of the P5, the 5 prominent members. The veto ensures that if the vital interests of any major global power are threatened, the UN system simply collapses.
So what are the arguments Russia and China are likely using to justify this veto beyond just a simple alliance? They can't just stand up and say, we don't like it. They have to cloak it in the language of international law.
Oh, absolutely. The arguments are always rooted in historical precedent and the principle of sovereignty. They would argue that the Western actions constitute illegitimate interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign nation, a claim that's often used to justify non-intervention.
And they'd point to past actions.
Of course. They would reference past Western interventions that lacked UN approval, framing this current Chapter 7 push as hypocritical or, expansionist. By casting the veto, they're not just protecting their ally, they're protecting the broader principle that no single global power bloc can dictate military action against a non-aligned state.
And the consequence of this gridlock is massive. It forces the West to bypass international consensus entirely and act unilaterally, or to rely on regional alliances like NATO.
It creates a bifurcated legal environment. Western actions are now legitimate only under the domestic law of the participating nations, or the NATO Charter, but they lack that binding international legitimacy of the UN. This failure seriously deepens the global political rift. It reinforces the idea that the world operates not under a unified legal framework, but under competing spheres of influence.
The UN's primary security function has been effectively paralyzed.
And that causes severe long-term damage to the structure of international law itself.
So, given the UN failure, all eyes turn to NATO. And the sources confirm that Article 5, the central tenet of the alliance, an attack on one is an attack on all, has not been invoked yet. Why the immense caution here, especially given the widespread cyber attacks and economic warfare that are clearly impacting NATO members?
Invoking Article 5 is the highest diplomatic and military threshold there is. It dictates that an attack on one member is considered an attack on all, legally and militarily, requiring every single NATO nation to treat the aggressor as an enemy. Western leaders are being incredibly cautious because invoking Article 5 instantly and formally escalates this localized conflict into what is, by definition, a global confrontation.
It becomes a world war.
By definition, it transforms the crisis into a world war, involving dozens of nations across 2 continents.
Is there ambiguity in whether a massive coordinated zero-day attack on European power grids constitutes an attack under Article 5? I mean, is a cyber attack a billet?
There is immense ambiguity, and the sources suggest that lawyers are frantically reviewing precedents as we speak. While NATO has affirmed that cyber attacks can trigger Article 5, they've never set a clear threshold. Does flickering lights quantify? Or does it have to be a catastrophic infrastructure failure that leads to mass casualties? No one knows.
So by avoiding the invocation, Western strategy confirms they are choosing to keep the conflict localized. It's a strategy of strategic damage containment.
Precisely. The current approach is one of containment paired with what they're calling punitive strikes.
And how does this differ fundamentally from a strategy of, say, regime change or full-scale war?
Containment is a Cold War doctrine, really. It's about preventing the expansion of an adversary's influence without engaging in direct all-out war. It relies on proxy pressure, sanctions, and military deterrence. Punitive strikes, as they're cited in the sources, are limited, targeted military actions.
Like hitting a missile site.
Right. Hitting a missile site, degrading a naval facility, actions designed to inflict immediate, measurable damage and signal resolve without crossing the threshold into a full-scale invasion or a sustained territorial operation.
This measured response is aimed squarely at controlling the escalation ladder. They're trying to degrade the aggressor's capacity and raise the cost of the conflict, all while maintaining plausible deniability that they are seeking war with the entire regional power structure.
That's the razor's edge they're walking. The West is trying to fight an unconventional hybrid war using highly conventional but severely limited tools. Every single punitive strike is calculated to have maximal strategic effect, like taking out the headquarters of the digital warfare unit while minimizing the risk of accidental escalation or giving the aggressor a political pretext to involve a wider coalition.
It's a high-stakes, constrained game of surgical warfare.
And it's all aimed at buying time for the strategy of attrition to take hold.
The diplomatic paralysis at the UN, coupled with this immense caution at NATO, it defines the geopolitical reality. Global leadership is attempting to manage a 21st century hybrid war with the political restraints of the 20th century. This leads us directly to the strategic calculation of endurance.
The aggressor's strategy of using asymmetric warfare, cyber attacks, economic choke points, none of this is random. All of these actions serve one overarching goal: to force the West into a protracted, resource-intensive war of attrition. But to understand that calculation, we first have to look at the internal stability of the aggressor state itself.
And the sources describe a very complex domestic situation. On one hand, there's a surge of nationalism, which is typical during wartime, but there are also strong indications of domestic instability bubbling just beneath the surface. Is the regime politically stable enough to sustain a long war against superior military forces?
That is the central strategic question for Western military planners. War often creates a temporary rally-around-the-flag effect, and the regime is clearly exploiting that to consolidate internal support. However, the sources confirm that this consolidation required the immediate implementation of severe, draconian measures domestically.
And draconian here means excessively harsh, severe, utterly uncompromising laws and enforcement. What are the specifics the sources are giving us about this suppression?
Well, first, martial law has been declared across all major population centers. This instantly suspends civil liberties, it abolishes the rule of civil law, and it puts military commanders in charge of civilian governance. But more critically, they have implemented a near-total information blockade.
They've severed the internet. A digital blackout.
A complete digital blackout, a tactic we've seen used globally to crush internal dissent.
What's the regime's calculation there? It seems like a huge risk.
It's a dual-purpose strategy. Externally, it prevents high-value intelligence from leaking out, which protects their military's operational security. Internally, and this is the main point, it is aimed squarely at neutralizing the organizational capability of a potential civil insurrection.
Because if people can't communicate?
Exactly. If people can't communicate, they can't coordinate, they can't see evidence of mass protest in other cities. Collective action against the government becomes logistically impossible. They are enforcing a force unity by severing all external and internal connective tissue.
That just sounds unsustainable in the long run. If the war drags on, the sources suggest that the seeds of a civil uprising could sprout.
The long-term risk for the regime is profound. You've got this combination of economic deprivation because Western sanctions are now biting hard, and that's exacerbated by the Hormuz closure and this brutal repression. It creates an explosive internal situation.
And the focus on the external conflict might divert security forces from internal policing,
which could create pockets of instability that could be exploited. However, it also means that for the West, the data quality about this internal stability is terrible. Reports from the front line and from inside the country are described as fragmentary.
Incomplete, disconnected, and often biased.
Completely. So Western strategists are essentially operating with a massive blind spot when it comes to judging their opponent's internal resilience, which is crucial for a war of attrition.
They don't know if they're one strike away from the whole thing collapsing.
Exactly. They don't know the true depth of popular support, the supply chain vulnerabilities within the regime, or even the real effectiveness of their punitive strikes. This data vacuum makes the entire war effort a high-stakes guessing game. You don't know how close you are to breaking the opponent's will.
So let's define the core strategy now. The war of attrition. This isn't about capturing territory. It's about gradually exhausting the enemy.
A war of attrition is a prolonged period of conflict where success is measured not by territorial gain, but by the relentless, gradual wearing out of the other side through a series of small, costly actions. It is the calculated opposite of a quick, decisive maneuver war like a blitzkrieg.
The aggressor knows they cannot win a conventional, quick victory against the combined technological might of NATO.
Not a chance. Their planes, their tanks, their naval vessels were all outnumbered and outclassed.
Therefore, their only rational hope is to make the conflict so messy, so financially exhausting, and so politically painful for the West that the alliance simply loses the political will to continue and sues for peace. They're betting on endurance over technical dominance.
This is a sophisticated understanding of Western democracy. They understand that the West's military resources are vast, but its political patience, particularly its aversion to casualties, is exceptionally thin. The aggressor is calculating that a high casualty rate, coupled with all the domestic chaos from the cyber and economic warfare, will turn public opinion against the effort.
Let's talk about that aversion, that strong dislike or disinclination toward casualties. This is the infamous body bag test.
It is the critical pressure point. It's the West's Achilles heel, strategically speaking. We have seen this historically, from Vietnam to the conflicts in Somalia. When body bags start returning to New York or London in significant numbers, public opinion, which is already fatigued by the cyber war and the economic turmoil of Hormuz, can shift overnight.
Unlike the regime they are fighting, Western governments cannot sustain a conflict without a popular mandate.
They simply can't. So the strategy isn't military defeat of the West, it's political defeat. By leveraging asymmetric warfare using inexpensive, mass-produced cruise missiles, old sea mines, and cheap attack drones, they can inflict disproportionately high costs on the West's expensive high-tech assets.
The cost asymmetry is vital here.
Absolutely vital. If the aggressor loses a drone that costs, say, $500,000, but it takes out a $5 million surface-to-air missile, that's a win for them. And if they occasionally get lucky and damage a $3 billion destroyer with one of those inexpensive missiles, their cost ratio is incredibly favorable.
They can sustain losses longer?
Much longer. Because their military-industrial base is simpler and their internal tolerance for suffering, which is enforced by those draconian measures, is far higher. They are seeking to exhaust the West's financial accounts and, more importantly, its political capital.
So the ultimate success of this attrition strategy hinges entirely on time and domestic resilience. The longer the conflict drags on, the more the aggressor believes their internal patience, however brutally enforced it is, will outlast the West's political endurance.
And that puts immense pressure back on Western leaders. Their challenge is not just winning skirmishes on the front line, but winning the endurance contest against their own domestic clocks, their own media cycles, and their own casualty aversion. It is a long, grinding path defined by volatility.
We have completed a pretty comprehensive analysis of the sources today, and the picture that emerges is one of extraordinary volatility. We are witnessing the first truly global hybrid war. Coordinated cyber attacks, crippling civilian life, a major global shipping choke point closed down by economic risk, a paralyzed United Nations Security Council.
And a high-stakes game of endurance rooted in this ruthless strategy of attrition. The sheer integration of psychological warfare in the digital age with the brutal military calculations of a prolonged conflict is what defines this crisis.
The battlefield is everywhere.
It is everywhere, and the lines of engagement are constantly shifting. You are never far from the threat, whether it's in your banking application or your energy supply.
And let's not forget the persistent, unnerving wildcard here. The high alert for sleeper cells and asymmetric attacks within Western borders. The fear, cited in the intelligence reports, is that the battlefield has no clear front lines anymore. The front line could be a subway station in London, it could be a server room in Silicon Valley, or a crowded shopping center.
That ubiquitous threat mandates vigilance and a kind of critical awareness from all of us.
As we conclude this deep dive, we have to return to that informational fog we discussed earlier. Given the extraordinary level of informational chaos, the deepfakes, the conflicting narratives, the deliberate campaign to obfuscate the truth, you, as a listener, must exercise extreme caution in your consumption of news this week.
Focus intensely on the critical vocabulary of uncertainty and contingency in media reports. It's more important than ever.
Pay close attention to the specific language that news organizations, who are trying desperately to remain impartial and truthful, are forced to use. Words like allegedly, unverified, reports suggest, and pending confirmation.
They're doing an enormous amount of heavy lifting right now.
Every single one of those terms is a flag.
Wow.
It's alerting you that the foundation of the reported fact is shaky, and possibly intentionally so, due to the aggressor's strategy of informational paralysis.
Use those terms not as indicators of failure on the part of the media, but as cues for your own critical analysis. Do not assume any single data point is reality, especially if it's unconfirmed by multiple, reputable, and independently verifying outlets. The informational war is specifically aimed at dissolving your certainty.
Your role as an informed critical learner is to resist that pressure and demand transparency,
which is becoming the most valuable commodity in this entire conflict.
The core conflict strategy is attrition, a game of endurance. So the final provocative thought for you to consider is this. In a war of attrition, the aggressor is banking on the West's ultimate democratic weakness, its aversion to pain. But does the very act of surviving massive economic and cyber chaos domestically, without fracturing entirely, itself become the ultimate act of democratic endurance?
Stay sharp, stay informed, and we will continue to monitor this complex and rapidly evolving situation. Until then, think critically and hold your sources accountable. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. If you are joining us today, chances are you're someone who is always looking for that edge. Not just to communicate, but to communicate well, strategically.
Right.
We're talking about moving past just getting your message across and really diving into the deep end of linguistic nuance.
And that nuance, it's funny, it often feels like that final impossible hurdle in mastering a language.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's actually one of your most powerful tools. The sources we're looking at today, they treat grammar and vocabulary not as these rigid academic rules you have to memorize.
No, not at all.
They're strategic instruments, tools for, high-stakes situations. The material we've pulled, it's from an advanced language study on strategic communication.
Right.
But we're going deeper. We're extracting the underlying psychological and strategic reasons why these particular structures are so incredibly effective when you're under pressure.
And that's really the core of our mission today, isn't it? To help you elevate your own communication from just functional to being genuinely influential. Our deep dive is using two extremely high-pressure scenarios to really illustrate this. First, we've got a harrowing personal crisis, a lost passport at the airport.
The universal nightmare.
The absolute worst. And then second, we're looking at a complex, high-stakes negotiation, an apartment rental.
And in both, we're going to analyze how these tiny, tiny shifts in language can completely transform things.
Yeah, things like moving from the simple past to the past continuous tense, or just choosing one subtle word over another. It can completely change how you're perceived and ultimately how influential your message is.
What's so fascinating here is getting to this idea that C2 level proficiency, that top tier, it's not about knowing all the words in the dictionary.
No.
It's about controlling the tone. It's about establishing an atmosphere, protecting your interests in a conflict. And that conflict could be internal, like pure panic, or it could be a really delicate diplomatic disagreement.
So our goal is to help you transform your simple, everyday speech into something more sophisticated, more impactful, by breaking down these very specific linguistic choices.
Turning you into a strategic communicator.
Okay, let's unpack this and get started. We have two really crucial halves to cover today. We're going to start with what we're calling the anatomy of chaos.
I like that.
We'll dissect how narrative tense can create this immersive experience of stress and vulnerability. Then we pivot, and we pivot hard, right into the world of high-stakes negotiation, where things like conditional language and elevated vocabulary become your tools for what the source calls diplomatic dissent.
And for securing favorable terms. By the end of this, you should have a whole new linguistic toolkit for both intense storytelling and really sharp critical thinking.
All right, let's start where so many personal crises begin, the travel disaster.
Of course, the airport.
The scenario that's laid out in the source material, it's so instantly relatable and just inherently stressful. You're standing at the check-in counter, you're surrounded by all these restless travelers.
You can feel the tension already.
And then you have that sinking feeling, that realization that the single most important document you have, your passport, is just gone. Yeah.
An environment like that demands language that can really capture that sensory overload, that escalating internal panic.
And this brings us straight to a really advanced application of the past continuous tense.
Okay.
Now, most people learn the past continuous, that's the was or were plus the incur form, as just a way to describe an action that was interrupted.
Like, I was eating dinner when the phone rang.
Exactly. Or an activity happening at a specific pastime. But what the sources reveal is its true strategic function in a narrative.
Which is?
It acts as a canvas of ongoing atmospheric pressure.
A canvas. I love that idea. So it's not about what happened next, it's about what was happening all around you, constantly.
Precisely. The traveler in the source used phrases like, I was standing in the queue and my hands were trembling uncontrollably.
Right. And crucially, they also described the environment around them. They said, the queue behind me was growing restless.
Yes. And functionally, what the past continuous does is it establishes that feeling of sensory overload, that state of endurance. You're just stuck in it.
You're stuck. Think about it. When you're describing a crisis, the chaos isn't just one single point in time. It's a persistent, overwhelming reality that you feel trapped inside of. By using that continuous form, the narrator forces the listener to be immersed in that ongoing environment. The constant movement, the constant pressure, the mounting stress.
It really captures that terrible, drawn-out moment where time almost seems to slow down,
Yes.
Nothing is actually advancing the plot, but your internal emotional clock is just racing. You're completely stuck in that one moment, just subjected to the environment, waiting for the catastrophe to hit.
And that waiting, that state of being subjected to the world around you, that is exactly the feeling of vulnerability that the past continuous just excels at conveying.
Right.
If you just use the simple past, I stood in the queue grew restless, it sounds like a list.
A sequence of events.
A sequence of resolved facts. It's dry. It lacks all the tension and the immediacy of the ongoing experience. The continuous tense forces the listener to endure that atmosphere right alongside the narrator.
Let's try to drive this home by actively contrasting the two styles. So if the narrator had only used the simple past, it might sound something like this. I arrived at the counter, I opened my bag, I saw the passport was gone, I panicked, the queue behind me sighed.
It's efficient, I'll give it that, but it's completely flat.
Emotionless.
Totally.
Yeah.
It loses all the drama, all the internal struggle. Now let's compare that to the narrator's actual style, where they mix the continuous and the simple past.
Okay.
Something like, The line was moving agonizingly slowly, and I was feeling this terrible cold dread creeping up my spine. My hands were already sweating as I reached the counter.
So that's the canvas.
That is the canvas. And then, bam! Suddenly the realization struck me. There's your simple past action. That the pouch was empty.
Wow, the distinction is so powerful when you put them side by side. The past continuous creates that atmospheric pressure, that background hum of chaos, which makes the specific action, the one delivered by the simple past, the strike, the realization, it makes it land with so much more force.
It isolates that singular, impactful moment from all the surrounding noise. It highlights the contrast between the ongoing struggle and that sudden, terrible climax.
So if you want a listener to truly understand the depth of an ordeal, you have to establish that atmospheric backdrop first.
You have to. And that emotional depth isn't even finished there. It's profoundly reinforced by the deliberate choice of vocabulary, the words that transfer the narrator's physiological and psychological distress.
Okay, let's look closer at the words the traveler actually chose. They didn't just say their heart was beating fast.
Yeah.
They used the word palpitating.
Palpitating. It's such a specific choice. It implies an irregular, frantic, almost distressed physiological reaction. It's almost a medical term.
Right. It's not just fast, it's out of control.
Exactly. It speaks directly to the body's involuntary response to fear, suggesting a complete loss of control. When you choose a word like that, you are achieving a strategic objective.
What's the objective there?
You're not just describing an event anymore. You're making the listener feel the physical manifestation of your stress. And this is crucial for establishing credibility in any crisis narrative. You sound like someone who genuinely suffered, not someone who's just casually recounting a delay.
But why is transferring that physical sensation so important strategically? Isn't it just, descriptive flair?
It's strategic because it builds vulnerability and sincerity. If you're relating a stressful event to, say, a supervisor or a jury or an authority figure, details that demonstrate genuine physical distress, like palpitating, make your account much harder to dismiss as just hyperbole or exaggeration. It grounds the story in physical reality.
That's a great point.
Think about a non-travel example. Instead of saying, I walked quickly to the exit, what if you said, my legs were churning beneath me?
Churning is great. It's speed, but it's also desperation. I get it.
Exactly.
And what about the physical search itself? Instead of saying they were looking through their bag,
Right.
the traveler said they rummaged through their luggage.
Rummaged. It suggests a total lack of composure, an element of pure desperation. It implies a messy, uncontrolled, frantic action that's driven by panic, not by careful organization.
It gives you a visual. You can see them just tearing their bag apart.
Yes. It deepens the listener's understanding of the internal crisis. It's not a casual search. It's an emergency excavation. If you say you were just looking through your files during a deadline crunch, it sounds fine.
Manageable.
But if you say you rummaged through the files, it conveys the high pressure and the urgency of your situation to your manager.
And then there's the final, and I think most painful psychological detail. That feeling of the collective judgment from the queue, their collective scrutiny piercing right through the traveler.
Scrutiny is just a magnificent choice of word there, because it's not just people looking at you. It implies intense, critical, even punitive observation. The traveler felt they were being analyzed and judged for causing this delay.
It elevates the whole thing. It goes from a simple logistical blunder to a full-blown psychological and social nightmare.
It absolutely does. It encapsulates that feeling that I think many of us have had in public, that the whole world is observing and criticizing our failure in that one moment.
So if we synthesize this first section, the strategic takeaway for you is pretty clear. Mastering the continuous tense provides the atmosphere and the vulnerability.
Right.
And then mastering specific evocative vocabulary words like palpitating, rummaged, scrutiny allows you to transfer that emotional immersion directly to your audience. You're crafting an experience. You're not just summarizing a list of facts. So the crisis, thankfully, it does resolve. But the narrative in the source material doesn't just stop there.
No, it gets even more granular.
It does. As the traveler recounts the decision-making process during the peak of the panic, the source pivots to this incredibly critical grammatical distinction about future actions. And this is vital for any professional who has to report on a chain of decisions.
Yeah, this section analyzes the distinction between using going to and using will for future actions.
Okay.
Specifically as it relates to prior intention, a plan, versus spontaneous in-the-moment decision-making, what we call volition.
Right.
And in high-stakes environments, getting this distinction right is a measure of your transparency and, frankly, your credibility.
Let's look at the traveler's own words, recounting 2 potential solutions they considered during the panic. For the first one, they said, quote, "I decided I was going to call the taxi."
Okay, so that structure it signals a concrete prior intention, a settled plan.
It was premeditated.
Exactly. Even though the action was still in the future when the decision was made, the plan was formed. It was decided upon as a strategy. When you use "was going to," you're signaling to your listener this was a thought-out, strategized move.
So what if they had just said, "I decided I would call the taxi"? What's the subtle difference there?
That's a good question. What often replaces will in reported speech, and it does indicate certainty from the speaker's perspective, but was going to has this stronger, clearer connection to intention and preparation.
I see.
It implies that calling the taxi became part of the mental blueprint for how to manage the crisis. It really suggests strategy.
Okay, so let's contrast that with the second action mentioned in the sources. The traveler said, "I will check the coffee shop."
And there it is. The simple future tense will indicates volition, a spontaneous decision made right in the heat of the moment.
An improvisation.
It was an immediate reaction, a flash of improvisation, or an immediate commitment that was not part of their pre-existing strategy. It signals to the listener, I decided this right now as I'm speaking.
So it's the linguistic line between "this was part of the emergency protocol I just formulated, that's going to," versus "this is what I commit to doing right this second, that's will."
Precisely. And mastering this subtle distinction is fundamental to advanced communication because it dictates the perceived reliability and sort of the naturalness of your account. In any environment where your decision-making is being scrutinized, think project management, military reporting, legal testimony clarity on whether an action was a prepared move going to, or an immediate reaction, will is absolutely essential.
Okay, let's run through some professional counterexamples to really illustrate this impact, because the airport scenario is just one case. Let's imagine a business context. A project manager is giving an update after a major system failure.
Okay, good one. So if that project manager says, before the server went down, we had already decided we were going to migrate the data next quarter.
Right.
They are signaling that the migration was a planned, deliberate strategy. It reflects competence and preparation. They were ahead of the problem.
Okay, now, what if that same manager says, "In response to this crash, I will allocate 2 senior engineers to the recovery task immediately"?
That signals an immediate, spontaneous commitment.
Decisive action.
It's a flash of leadership, an action decided upon right as they are speaking. If they had said, I am going to allocate 2 senior engineers, it sounds a bit like they had time to deliberate, which might actually undermine the perceived urgency of the moment.
That's so subtle, but so important.
The use of will conveys that decisive, immediate action.
Or let's think about a negotiation. If a client says, "In our meeting last week, we decided we were going to offer you 10% less than the asking price."
Oof.
The going to makes that sound like a firm, settled position that was established beforehand. It has weight.
But if they interrupt their partner mid-sentence and say, wait, I will check with our legal team right now, that action is spontaneous, is dictated by the unfolding discussion, a quick, in-the-moment commitment.
So if you misuse these forms, you could fundamentally misrepresent your level of preparation or the timing of your decisions.
Absolutely.
If you use will for something that was clearly a planned move, you risk sounding disorganized or like you're making it up as you go.
And if you use going to for something that was an immediate necessity, you might sound like you're, overstating your foresight, trying to pretend you had a plan all along.
It all connects back to credibility for the listener, doesn't it?
100%. When you are testifying to a set of facts, your linguistic choices should mirror reality. Was the action the result of a pre-existing blueprint? That's going to. Or was it a necessary improvisation? That's will.
That precision is the linguistic fingerprint of a strategic communicator.
And crucially, as we saw with was going to, this distinction holds true even when you're talking about the past. When you recount past actions, you have to correctly signal whether the intention existed before the action was spoken or whether the commitment just arose during the conversation itself.
And this depth of understanding, this is what separates C1 fluency from true C2 mastery. And now we make the sharp pivot. We are leaving the chaotic airport behind, and we're entering this controlled, high-stakes environment of a negotiation.
A different kind of stress.
A very different kind. The stakes here are contractual, legal, and financial. The goal is no longer about narrative clarity. It's about diplomatic assertion.
Right. Asserting your limits without completely torching the professional relationship.
This is where that linguistic strategy shifts entirely to what we're calling diplomatic dissent and conditional bargaining.
Exactly. And this requires a very specific toolkit that's focused on polite conflict. The scenario involves a couple, Lisa and Jake, negotiating terms with a leasing agent for an apartment. And they need to express some very serious concerns about the property's quality and the price, but without coming across as abrasive or, unreasonable.
This is where Lisa's genius use of hedging really comes into play. She's not just throwing down ultimatums. She's softening her critique to maintain that professional tone while making her boundaries absolutely crystal clear.
And the sources highlight two perfect examples of this kind of advanced verbal hedging. First, when she's talking about the structure of the apartment, she says, "I'm apprehensive about the acoustic insulation."
Apprehensive about.
And second, concerning the finances, she says, "I'm hesitant to commit to a lease that stretches our fiscal limits."
Okay, let's analyze apprehensive about. If Lisa had just said, the soundproofing is insufficient, or even, this place is too loud.
Right, a direct accusation.
It's a direct, objective accusation, and that puts the agent instantly on the defensive. It turns the negotiation into a confrontation over facts.
But by using apprehensive about, she strategically shifts the focus. It moves from the objective failure of the building to her subjective future feeling about living there.
Oh, that's clever.
She isn't accusing, she's signaling a concern that's related to her own required state, which is a tranquil environment.
This is brilliant because it makes the critique so much less confrontational.
The agent now has a problem to solve.
A problem to solve, exactly. And the problem is alleviating Lisa's apprehension rather than just defending the building's construction. This framing keeps the dynamic collaborative.
It's a pure de-escalation technique. She's asserting her needs, but she's framing them internally, not as an external attack. And hesitant to commit regarding the price. It performs a very similar diplomatic function. She isn't saying, "We can't afford this."
Which is a final, blunt refusal, and it signals financial weakness.
Right. Instead, she is asserting caution and prudence.
By saying she is hesitant to commit to something that stretches our fiscal limits, she's essentially telling the agent, we are financially capable, but we are also prudent investors.
Yes.
She's respecting the agent and the price point, while firmly signaling that the terms, as they stand, violate her threshold for financial prudence.
And the function of hedging is just vital in any high-stakes interaction. It softens the rejection, it frames your dissent as caution, and it maintains the professional dynamic.
It keeps the conversation open for compromise.
It turns a potential impasse into a mutual problem-solving exercise.
And this professional tone is amplified by their deliberate choice to elevate the register, to use advanced C2 level vocabulary. And these choices aren't just about sounding smart, are they?
No, not at all. They're about signaling seriousness to the agent. They communicate that they are dealing with prepared, serious individuals who understand formal agreements.
Okay, let's break down some of this vocabulary. Why use the word luminosity instead of just saying light?
Well, luminosity carries a technical, almost architectural weight to it. It suggests Lisa isn't just, observing the room. She is evaluating the quality, the quantity, the aesthetic impact of the light source. It implies a detailed, almost professional analysis.
It's like if you tell a vendor your product looks good, that's just subjective.
Right.
But if you say the product's aesthetics meet our specifications for visual fidelity, you are speaking the language of assessment.
And the term fenestration is even more telling.
Fenestration, not a word you hear every day.
No, it's the specific architectural term for the arrangement, placement, and design of windows and doors.
So using it instantly demonstrates domain-specific knowledge.
It signals, I know what I'm looking for and I understand building structure. The agent can't just offer a vague assurance about the windows if the tenant is sitting there discussing their fenestration.
It shuts down the easy answers.
It does. And similarly, her demand for a tranquil environment rather than just a quiet one. And her concern that noise would be detrimental to her productivity. There's a real distinction there.
There is. Quiet is just the absence of noise, but tranquil, that's a deeper state. It implies peace, calm, a lack of mental disturbance. She's demanding an environment that supports a specific mental state, not just a physical noise level.
And detrimental is a highly formal word that implies active harm. The noise isn't just bad for her work, it's actively damaging her professional capacity.
So that frames the lack of quiet not as a simple inconvenience, but as a tangible threat to her livelihood.
And that leads us right back to her use of fiscal limits.
Right. Using fiscal limits instead of budget or money. It frames their personal spending plan as a formal, almost corporate boundary.
Yes, a set of economic parameters that have to be respected by the other party. It's the language of contracts and finance, not just personal household spending.
So if we connect this back to you, the listener, the application is so powerful. The next time you're negotiating a service contract or discussing terms with a client, pay really close attention to the words you use. By adopting this elevated register, talking about detrimental impacts or financial parameters, you immediately signal that you are operating on a level that expects and demands professional formality and precision.
And that sophistication can really shift the balance of power in your favor.
The lesson from this section is that advanced vocabulary and hedging, they're not just ornamentation, they are shields, and they are levers.
They protect you from confrontation while allowing you to firmly assert your non-negotiable standards.
Okay, so with the couple's professional stance now firmly established through that diplomatic dissent, the negotiation moves into the core bargaining phase.
The back and forth.
Exactly. And the agent now needs to deliver a counteroffer that sounds equally formal, significant, and authoritative. This is where we encounter this linguistic masterstroke, the formal conditional inversion.
This is active bargaining at a very, very high level.
Yeah.
The agent has to make a concession, but it's contingent on a new obligation from the couple.
Right, extending the lease from 12 to 18 months.
So they reply to Lisa's request for a price reduction with this statement.
Yeah.
However, should you be willing to sign an 18-month lease, I could authorize a reduction.
The standard, basic phrasing would be the first conditional. If you are willing to sign an 18-month lease.
Sure.
But the agent inverts it to, should you be willing? Why does that structural shift matter so much?
Well, this inversion immediately elevates the politeness and the formality of the entire proposition. Yeah. It's a feature of highly formal English, often written, legal or business English. It suggests that the condition being offered is a structured, significant concession, not just some casual suggestion. It makes the entire offer sound more polished, more serious, and more reflective of a structured business process.
It also creates a kind of necessary psychological distance, doesn't it?
In what way?
By using this formal inversion, the agent is moving the discussion away from a friendly, casual chat about apartment features and into a professional discussion about contract terms.
Absolutely. That distance reinforces the authority of the agent and the weight of the agreement they're trying to forge. They're basically saying, I am offering a structural term that is tied to a contractual obligation, rather than just, hey, I'm doing you a favor.
Right.
Inversion is a subtle way of communicating seriousness about consequences and obligations.
And to show true mastery of this conditional structure, it's probably worth noting that should you be willing is just one type of this formal inversion, right?
That's a great point, yeah.
What are a couple of other high-level structures our listeners should be aware of?
Okay, so for unlikely or highly hypothetical conditions, you might hear the second conditional inversion. Were I to agree to those terms, the company would require additional collateral.
Which is far more formal than just saying, if I agreed to those terms.
Far more. And if we're talking about conditions that were not met in the past, which led to a past outcome, you'd use the third conditional inversion, something like, had I known the insulation was subpar, I would have layered the initial asking price.
So these inversions signal that you are structuring your language at the absolute highest level of formality and control.
Exactly.
But let's pivot from that to what might be the most delicate and legally vital distinction in this whole negotiation. And it relates directly back to certainty versus possibility. It's the difference between using if and when.
Oh, this is huge. This tiny grammatical choice carries immense legal and formal weight. When you are drafting agreements, you absolutely cannot afford to mix these two up.
So let's look at Lisa's cautious language about potential future events.
Yeah.
She asks about the pet policy by saying, if we get a cat.
The if signals a hypothetical possibility. It may happen, it may not happen. She's just ensuring that should the possibility become a reality,
right,
the contract allows for it.
She is not committing to the event.
Not at all. Now compare that to the agent's language. The agent says, when you move out, when they're discussing the cleaning deposit.
Right.
The when implies an absolute certainty. The agent knows that all leases eventually end. The action is inevitable, even if the timing is still unknown.
So the implication of mixing these up is actually profound. What if Lisa had said, when we get a cat, we will pay the pet deposit?
Well, she would be legally presuming, and you could argue she'd be committing to, the event of getting a cat. The agent might then try to hold her accountable for that implied commitment later on.
And conversely, what if the agent, when discussing the end of the tenancy, had said, if you move out?
It sounds so weak. Unconfident. It's as if they are questioning the inevitability of the lease ending. It completely undermines their authority in that moment.
So this is where language really meets critical thinking. Mastering this distinction forces you to analyze the reality of the situation. You have to ask yourself, is this event certain or is it merely possible?
And that analytical step has to happen before you structure your sentence. When you are dealing with facts, you use when. When you are dealing with possibilities, with hypotheticals, you use if.
In formal structures, that kind of precision is just non-negotiable.
It's the difference between being merely fluent and being legally precise. And that level of detail ensures that your linguistic precision matches your actual intent, which eliminates any ambiguity that could lead to misinterpretation or, contractual liability down the line. Hashtag outro.
So this deep dive has traveled from the absolute frenzy of an airport disaster all the way to the measured strategic phrasing of a legal negotiation.
Quite a journey.
It really is. And the fundamental lesson that connects these two very disparate scenarios is that mastery in communication lies in leveraging the strategic power of grammar and vocabulary.
To control tone, emotion, and external perception.
Exactly. We saw how grammar functions as this strategic lever, using the past continuous to paint a scene of pervasive chaos and vulnerability.
Or employing those formal conditionals, like inversion, to establish a high level of professionalism and authority in bargaining.
And vocabulary choice proved to be just as crucial, conveying physiological stress with a word like palpitating, or signaling financial seriousness and prudence with a phrase like fiscal limits.
The goal, as the sources really clearly lay out, is that C2 level of proficiency, which involves communicating not just what happened, but how seriously you take the matter and what emotional state you are actually in.
When you start strategically applying these structures, you shift from just being understood to being truly influential.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the strategic application of grammar and vocabulary is the ultimate differentiator. It's what separates an average communicator from a truly persuasive one. Language is the tool you use to leverage your position, whether you're trying to convince a listener of the severity of a crisis or you're successfully negotiating better terms in a crucial agreement. Precision is fundamentally power.
So we want to leave you with this final provocative thought to take into your next high-stakes situation. The next time you face a stressful conversation, whether it's a delay, a disagreement, or a financial discussion, just pause for a moment and critically evaluate your language. Ask yourself, are you describing the background chaos using the continuous tense to immerse your listener in that experience? Are you asserting your limits using hedging techniques like apprehensive about? And are you structuring your demands using the diplomatic high-level language of conditional inversion?
If you can answer yes to those questions,
the language you choose will dictate a far more favorable outcome. Stay curious. Welcome back to the deep dive, where we promise to cut through all that information noise and really just deliver the essential knowledge you need to be truly well-informed.
That's right. You brought the curiosity, you gave us the stack of sources, and today we're here to act as your guides. We're navigating the material to pull out the crucial strategies that govern how we communicate in these really high-stakes situations.
We know your goal is to get that knowledge quickly, but also, thoroughly. And today's subject is just a fascinating masterclass in applied precision.
It really is. We're moving away from the abstract theories of language for a bit, and we're diving right into the practical, binding reality of contract negotiation.
And our source material is, it's compelling. We've got excerpts from a study called Mastering the Language of Negotiation and Contractual Nuance.
In this study, it tracks a couple, Jake and Lisa, as they move from that initial kind of casual interest in a potential new home.
Right. This is nice phase.
Exactly. And it follows them into the critical, demanding phase of negotiating all the legal details with the agent.
And that specific moment, that transition, it is just a goldmine for linguistic analysis, isn't it?
It is, because it so clearly marks the pivot point. The moment when the language used moves from being, subjective, all about feelings, aesthetics, general impressions,
only being completely objective.
Transactional,
Yeah.
conditional.
Yes. We're suddenly talking about the language of finance, of liability, of enforceable obligations. It's a whole different world.
So our mission today is, it's very targeted. We're going to meticulously dissect the specific linguistic strategies that Jake and Lisa use.
The strategies they deploy to maintain that cooperative, sort of pleasant atmosphere.
Which is absolutely essential for a successful outcome.
While at the same time extracting the hard, often uncomfortable contractual information they need before they sign anything.
The entire deep dive is anchored in this idea of what you call pragmatic competence. Well, let's unpack this. Right. So to clarify that term right at the start, pragmatic competence isn't just knowing your grammar rules. It's knowing what to say.
And maybe more importantly, how to say it.
Exactly. How to say it based on the specific social relationship, the environment you're in, and, the real goal of the conversation.
So in a negotiation, that means being, both professional and polite?
While still being uncompromisingly specific. And the main tool we're going to be looking at today is something called mitigating language.
So we've set the stage. We've got this shift from feeling to contract. Let's look at the specific tools they use to manage that tension.
The sources set the scenario up perfectly. Jake and Lisa, they've crossed this emotional threshold. They've decided they are inclined to proceed.
Okay, that phrase right there, inclined to proceed, that's worth stopping on for a second. It feels really deliberate.
Oh, it's an elegant piece of linguistic engineering. It really is.
How so? I mean, it sounds pretty straightforward. It just sounds like they're interested.
It is straightforward, but functionally, it's a commitment signal that's wrapped in a disclaimer.
Okay.
It signals serious intent. They're telling the agent they're mentally ready to accept the financial and legal side of things, but they haven't finalized a thing. It uses language to create leverage.
Yeah.
It basically tells the agent, look, we're 90% there, but that last 10%, that depends on your ability to satisfy our contractual questions.
That is smart. It puts the burden of proof, the need for clarity, squarely back on the agent, and it keeps the momentum of the negotiation going.
Think about it. If they had just said, we'll take it,
all their leverage would be gone. They'd have no real standing to ask for stipulations or clarification.
Exactly. And this commitment signal, this inclined to proceed, that's the trigger for this really profound shift in what we call linguistic register.
The register being the style of language.
Precisely.
Yeah.
As the sources point out, in that initial phase, they're first viewing the property, the language is all descriptive and subjective.
Right. You hear things like, oh, the sunlight streams so beautifully through the main windows, or
I feel good about how close it is to the park. It's all about the experience.
It's human, it's fluid, and most importantly, it's non-binding.
But the moment they say they're inclined to proceed, that entire vocabulary has to be dropped. It has to go.
And why is that? Why discard it completely?
Because emotional vocabulary has absolutely no place in a binding legal agreement. The negotiation phase, it demands language that is transactional and conditional.
The conversation stops being about ambiance.
And it starts being about consequences. We stop talking about the view and we start talking about the maintenance schedule, the liability coverage, the specific terms of payment.
That shift is where a lot of people, even highly fluent speakers, can really falter. They might have a C2 level vocabulary for describing a painting.
But they struggle when they have to move into the cold, hard logic of contract law. They might say something like, I feel like the appliance policy is unfair.
And that phrasing, that I feel, it just immediately undermines their authority, doesn't it?
Completely. An agent can easily dismiss a feeling. They can't dismiss a well-phrased inquiry about liability or protocol.
So if you say, I feel the price is too high, you're just inviting an emotional or, a dismissive response.
But if you ask, what data points support this valuation in the current market, given the lack of recent upgrades to the primary system?
And then you force a professional, data-driven response. You've changed the entire frame of the conversation.
So the shift is essential because the ultimate goal, the deliverable here, is the contract, which is, by its very definition, just a comprehensive list of what happens if certain conditions are met or if they're not met. The language has to reflect that binding, conditional reality.
But here's the challenge that the sources really highlight. If you suddenly switch from being, warm and complimentary about the apartment to being blunt and aggressively transactional.
You risk shattering that cooperative relationship you've just spent time building.
Right. The goal is to maintain that warmth, that impression of being a sophisticated, agreeable client while asking these hard, cold questions.
And that's where mitigating language comes in. It's like the diplomatic wrapper for the demanding content inside.
You want the agent to see you as a highly desirable, long-term tenant, not someone who's going to be a constant, antagonistic headache.
Mitigating language is so crucial because it lets you do three things at once. First, it softens the delivery of a difficult request.
Okay.
Second, it shifts the focus away from being a personal attack on the agent's decision-making.
And third,
it often frames the whole inquiry as a kind of joint problem-solving exercise. And we're about to see exactly how Jake and Lisa pull this off.
Okay, let's get into the specifics of how they execute this.
So the first step, as the sources note, is just avoiding the blunt ask. Jake and Lisa didn't just send a list of demands.
No.
They indicated their inclination to proceed, but they specified they needed several stipulations clarified.
The word clarified is masterful there. It suggests the information already exists, they just need access to it. It's not a demand for new things.
It implies joint accountability for understanding the terms. They didn't say, we require changes.
They said, we require clarity. And that's a massive difference in tone and expectation. It's an invitation to share information, not a challenge to authority.
And this leads us directly into the core strategy of depersonalization, which is, it's perhaps the most valuable tool in the high-stakes negotiation playbook.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's analyze Lisa's opening move on the monthly rate. The asking price is $2,000, and she says, is there any flexibility in that figure, considering our budget?
This is a textbook example of pragmatic competence in action. Just beautiful.
Break it down for us. What's so special about it?
Lisa is not asking the agent, the person standing right in front of her, to reduce their commission or, sacrifice their own authority.
Okay.
She is asking about the flexibility of the abstract administrative concept, the figure.
In that figure. By using that phrase, she subtly separates the monetary request from the agent as a human being who might, take offense.
Exactly. The issue isn't the agent's competence or the owner's greed. The issue is simply the number itself, which theoretically exists independent of the individual agent.
Let's consider the alternatives for a second just to see how good that is.
Great idea. What if she had used a less sophisticated, more blunt approach?
We won't pay $2,000. Can you give us a discount?
Way too aggressive. It attacks the agent's authority and it invites immediate defensiveness.
Or what about the other way? The needy approach. Our budget is really tight and we really need a lower price.
That invites sympathy, not respect. It centers the request on a personal financial need, which, frankly, is irrelevant to the agent's job.
And then there's the vague, indirect way. That price seems a little high. Are there ways we can reduce our overall costs?
Which is too vague. It allows the agent to offer some tangential, low-value concession like, we can waive the $50 application fee without ever touching the core price.
Lisa's phrasing just avoids all of those pitfalls. It keeps the negotiation completely objective. She also adds that mitigating phrase, considering our budget. Why is that part so crucial?
Because it transforms the request from just a bare demand into a contextualized constraint. By mentioning the budget, she provides a rationale that the agent can acknowledge professionally.
It makes the request less about her personal desire and more about logistical alignment.
Right. The agent is now tasked with finding a solution within the company's policy that respects the client's stated constraint.
You're treating the agent as a problem solver, not just a gatekeeper. You're making them a partner in finding a structure that makes the figure work for both parties.
That is the essence of cooperative negotiation. You want the agent advocating for you upstairs to their boss, not defending the status quo against you.
And this high level of pragmatic competence, we see it mirrored in Jake's contribution when he brings up a potential conflict noise.
Yes, and conflict resolution is perhaps the highest stakes area of any contract language. Jake asks, if the disturbance becomes untenable.
Let's just linger on that word, untenable. It's highly specific. It immediately signals a very sophisticated vocabulary.
It does. The source material defines untenable as impossible to maintain or defend. By using this term, Jake is achieving a strategic projection of competence.
He's not just saying, what if the neighbor plays loud music, which is, a really common subjective complaint.
He's setting a high, legally resonant threshold. He's essentially saying, we understand that some noise is expected in apartment living. We are sophisticated enough not to complain about minor things.
But, he's implying, if the noise level reaches a state that legally voids the implied contract of peaceful occupancy, what is the clear, documented protocol for recourse?
And this preemption is just vital. It signals to the agent, who is probably used to dealing with frivolous complaints, that Jake and Lisa are serious. They know the difference between loud footsteps and an existential breach of their living environment.
So their use of untenable acts as a form of, social and legal currency?
I think that's a great way to put it. It communicates that they know the rules and they understand the legal implications of the terms being discussed.
But isn't there a risk? Doesn't using such strong, almost jargon-like language risk sounding pretentious or even overly aggressive? Why not just ask, what if the noise is too loud?
That's a fair challenge, and it really goes back to that idea of pragmatic competence. In a casual chat with friends, yes, untenable might sound pretentious.
But this isn't a casual chat.
Not at all. We are in a high-stakes transactional negotiation with a professional representative. In this specific register, precision is valued over conversational comfort. The professionalism of the situation demands technical language.
So the risk of sounding pretentious is mitigated by the environment itself. The Register of Contract Negotiation actually requires these precise, formal terms to define the boundaries accurately.
Absolutely. And the agent's response just confirms that this high register language worked. The agent didn't brush it off with a vague reassurance like, oh, don't worry, it's a quiet building.
No, they responded procedurally. They said they adhere to a strict noise ordinance, and that recourse involves filing a formal grievance,
upon which management will intervene for repeated infractions.
That is just a masterclass in a professional contractual response. It shifts the entire discussion from the hypothetical, the noise problem, to the established, documented reality of the protocol for resolution.
It's procedural. It defines steps. It removes the emotional element entirely. Jake's sophisticated language forced the agent to provide an equally professional, protocol-driven answer.
The takeaway here for you, the listener, seems to be that vocabulary in this context, it's not about impressing people, it's about control.
It is about control. High register vocabulary gives you control over the level and the nature of the response you receive. If you use vague emotional language, you're going to get vague emotional answers.
But if you use precise technical language,
you demand and you receive precise procedural answers.
And crucially, the agent, by defining those steps, the ordinance, the formal grievance, the intervention, has now legally defined a potential future liability for the management. And that clarity is exactly what Jake and Lisa were after.
Now we get to move to the counteroffer, where the agent shows their own masterful control of transactional language by using the conditional structure.
Which is the linguistic backbone of all binding agreements, right?
It is. The agent establishes early on that the original price, the figure, is fairly rigid. This is important because it sets the baseline expectation.
Right. They're signaling that no easy concessions are coming.
But then they immediately link any potential flexibility to a counter condition.
This is negotiation 101, but it's the language that makes it so effective.
It's executed with linguistic finesse. The rule is, concession must be coupled with condition. If you want the price reduction, you have to offer something of equal value.
Which, in this case, is increased certainty for the landlord, a longer lease.
Exactly. The agent offers a potential $50 reduction, saving $900 over the term, but they use a highly formal conditional structure to introduce it.
This is the part. Were you to consent to an extended lease term 18 months rather than the standard 12, I could authorize a reduction to $1,950.
That specific phrasing, were you to consent, takes us into the formal, sometimes called literary or even archaic, subjunctive mood. It's rare in modern conversational English, but it persists powerfully in legal and formal writing.
So why? Why use that highly stylized structure instead of the simpler, more common if you consent?
Because it elevates the register and it emphasizes the gravity of the decision. The subjunctive mood here, it functions to express a hypothetical but necessary condition for the reality of the offer to even exist.
So saying if you consent suggests a simple action.
A simple, straightforward action. But saying, were you to consent, it imbues that action with greater weight, with more formality and significance.
It's suggesting a major conscious decision on their part that will then trigger a formal adjustment from management.
It makes the commitment feel less like a casual choice and more like a formal, almost ceremonial exchange of value. The reduction isn't simply if you agree, but it's contingent upon this formal, hypothetical, future state of conscious agreement.
And this detail matters so much because they're dealing with these precise, quantifiable terms.
And Jake immediately recognizes that transactional balance. He notes that the $50 reduction equates to a savings of $900 over the tenure.
That reciprocal precision is key. The agent offers a precise conditional concession, and Jake immediately calculates the precise value. It shows both parties are operating on a serious, binding level.
There are no vague promises here.
Okay, let's move to the second powerful example of this binding language, which comes up when they're talking about the pet policy. Lisa asks if adopting a cat is permissible.
And the agent's response is complex. It's a yes, but it's a yes that is immediately constrained by two mandatory conditions.
He says, pets are permitted, subject to a $300 deposit. This sum is fully refundable, provided that the property sustains no damage upon your departure.
And that phrase, provided that, is noted in the sources as perhaps the most legally critical phrase in the entire conversation. It functions as a formal, binding alternative to if.
This is a point that I think we really need to elaborate on, because on the surface, if and provided that seem almost interchangeable.
They seem to, but they function in completely different registers.
Okay, so if I say I'll go to the store if the rain stops, I'm just expressing a possibility, right? An uncertainty. The rain might stop, it might not.
Exactly. If implies possibility, chance, or just mere uncertainty. Provided that, however, is what we call a term of legal art.
A term of art.
It means on the express condition that. It removes that element of uncertainty, and it emphasizes a necessary prerequisite that must be actively met for the promise, in this case the refund, to be fulfilled.
So if the contract said, the deposit is refundable if the property sustains no damage, a clever lawyer might be able to argue that if implies that the landlord has to prove the damage exists and the outcome is somehow uncertain.
Yes, because if can imply a hypothetical scenario rather than a mandatory requirement. But when a contract states the deposit is fully refundable provided that the property sustains no damage, the linguistic function shifts completely.
What does it become?
It's stating the refund is legally contingent upon the successful fulfillment of this single non-negotiable term. It places the burden of proof and performance entirely on the tenant.
So it transforms the condition from a potential obstacle into an absolute contractual requirement. You, the tenant, must affirmatively ensure that the condition is met for the refund to happen. It's not something left to chance.
Think about this in a business context. A company might tell a contractor, "We'll authorize the final payment if the audit report is clean."
That sounds like a possibility.
It does.
What?
But if they say, "We will authorize the final payment provided that the audit report is clean," it elevates that clean audit report to a fundamental, non-negotiable term of the agreement.
It's the difference between a possibility and a mandatory trigger.
You're eliminating ambiguity, which is the singular goal of all contractual language. And we see this often combined with other high-register terms like subject to or on the express condition that. They all serve to stress the essential, non-waivable nature of the contingency.
And this level of detail in the language shows why the agent sees Jake and Lisa as high-value clients. They understand the seriousness of the term.
And they immediately accept the conditional liability structure. Jake states they will remit the deposit at that time if they proceed with the pet later. He accepts that liability proactively.
Which is another interesting nuance, isn't it? Jake correctly uses if there, because the future action getting a cat truly is uncertain. It is a possibility, not a certainty.
It's a beautiful contrast to the certainty of the contract's eventual termination, which I think is where we should head next.
Okay, this final section is where we really dissect the details that separate, say, a B2 level speaker, someone who is fluent and functional, from a C2 level speaker who really commands native level precision, especially in these formal registers.
Yes, these are the small mistakes that can subtly undermine a professional impression.
So let's start with that classic semantic confusion the sources bring up, rent versus rental. We hear this mix-up constantly, even from highly advanced learners.
It's such a common semantic pitfall because the words are so closely related, conceptually. But in the world of property and finance, they have distinct, non-interchangeable functions.
And the confusion usually happens when people use rental as a noun to mean the monthly payment, right? They'll say something like, I have to pay my rental.
Or, What is the monthly rental cost? That is precisely the error. The core payment is always referred to as rent. Rent is the noun. It refers to the periodic payment due for occupying the space. The rent is due on the first of the month. You pay the rent.
So where does rental fit in then?
Rental has two main functions. Most commonly, it acts as an adjective that modifies a noun. A rental agreement, a rental property, the rental market. It just describes the nature of the thing.
And the second function.
Second, it can be a noun, but it refers to the act or the arrangement of renting, often for short-term things. You get a car rental. You might talk about the concept of apartment rental, but you don't generally pay the rental for your monthly home.
Okay, so just to be crystal clear for everyone listening, if I am defining the document I'm signing, I call it a rental agreement.
Yes.
But if I'm defining the money I hand over each month, it is the rent.
Exactly. And in a high-stakes negotiation where precision is everything, mixing these up, saying, what is the monthly rental? It's a linguistic slip. It suggests a lack of mastery over this specific financial and legal domain.
It's a tiny red flag that the professional on the other side might subconsciously register, and it could, I suppose, weaken your perceived competence.
Precision equals professionalism.
Let's move on from semantics to grammar, and let's spend some serious time on modals. Can, may, and could. In casual conversation, we use these interchangeably all the time, but in formal context, their differences really define social hierarchy and the degree of certainty.
This is one of the clearest markers of B2 versus C2 fluency. A C2 speaker understands almost instinctively that modals define the degree of certainty, authority, and possibility in any communication.
So just to review, can usually implies ability, physical, or organizational capacity.
Right. May implies permission or possibility.
And could generally implies a hypothetical possibility or a softer, more tentative willingness to do something.
Let's look at the agent's language again. When he was asked about pets, Lisa asked if pets were permissible. The agent responded using the passive voice. He said, "Pets are permitted."
That phrasing is so formal, it's not, yeah, I can let you have a pet.
Precisely. Are permitted uses that passive voice to indicate an established, formalized rule or policy that's been handed down from the governing body, from the building management.
The agent isn't granting his personal permission.
No, he is serving as an authoritative spokesperson for the existing written rule. It eliminates any personal bias and just confirms the policy.
Okay, let's play this out with a hypothetical. Imagine if the agent had been negotiating something that was outside the standard policy, like, say, asking for permission to install an air conditioning unit where one wasn't currently allowed. What would that sound like?
That's a great hypothetical. So if the agent had said, we can arrange for a special AC installation, they would be confirming immediate ability, a stronger, more immediate commitment.
Meaning they have the physical and logistical capacity to do it. It's possible.
Yes. But what if they're still unsure if the landlord will sign off on the expense or the structural change?
Then what?
Then they would use could. We could arrange for an installation depending on the landlord's final approval. This is the use of could to signal a hypothetical possibility or a willingness to engage in the negotiation.
So it buys time, it signals potential, but it retains the necessary leverage and, I guess, the ambiguity they need to get further sign-offs.
Using could basically signals we have the potential capacity to do this, and we're willing to try if certain yet-to-be-met conditions are fulfilled. It softens the commitment beautifully.
You know, if you're negotiating a raise at work, this distinction is so clear. If you say, I know I can handle the responsibilities of the next level, you're asserting your capacity, your ability.
That's right. And if you say to your manager, I believe the company may find justification to increase my compensation to X level, you're suggesting a formal possibility based on policy, not just your personal effort.
And if the manager says back to you, we could discuss a raise in Q3.
They're signaling that hypothetical willingness, but they're retaining control and making sure the conversation remains contingent upon future performance or, budget approval.
It all comes down to controlling the degree of certainty and authority that you're projecting in your language. It's about being explicit about whether you're discussing ability, policy, or possibility.
That right there is C2 mastery in practice. Which brings us to our final crucial distinction in this section. The difference between if and when, especially when you're discussing the life cycle of the contract itself.
As we mentioned earlier, Jake correctly used if we decide to get a cat. That future action is uncertain, it's a possibility.
Correct. But when we transition to the end of the contractual agreement, The source material dictates that the correct legal and pragmatic usage is when you move out.
That seems like an incredibly subtle difference for such a massive legal implication. Why is the termination of a lease considered a certainty, thus demanding when?
Because every contract, by its very nature, has a defined duration, or it has a mechanism for termination that will inevitably be invoked at some point. The current lease is for 12 months or maybe 18 months.
So when that 12 or 18 months is up, the conditions of termination are triggered. It's a definite event.
Precisely. Even if the tenants renew, the current contract must first terminate. A new one begins. So the event, the end of the current contract and the subsequent move out, is a certainty in the legal framework.
So using if you move out in a contract would imply that staying indefinitely or having the contract just sort of lapse without a formal termination is a possibility.
Which is rarely, if ever, true in a formal lease agreement. So when defining the clauses associated with the conclusion of the tenancy, like the property inspection, the final utility payment, the security deposit return, the language must reflect the certainty of that event.
So the agent, therefore, speaks of the inspection that will occur when you move out, which ensures that the conditional clauses, like the refund provided that there is no damage, are tied to an event that is legally guaranteed to happen.
It just reinforces the finite nature of the agreement. It's a powerful distinction. In conversations about your personal plans, use if. In conversations about contractual certainty and obligation, use when.
So mastery over these small conjunctions, it just reinforces the authority and the enforceability of the entire legal document. This level of detail has been remarkable. We've covered depersonalization, the power of sophisticated legal vocabulary,
the binding function of formal conditional language,
and these fine-grained semantic and grammatical distinctions that truly separate advanced fluency from professional precision.
This deep dive has really shown that true fluency is, well, it's less about sounding native and more about strategic precision. We've moved from the visceral, the emotions about finding a home, all the way to the objective, defining liability and payment.
So what does this all mean? If we synthesize what we've learned, the key seems to be the conscious management of your linguistic register.
Yes. When Jake and Lisa felt the apartment was right, they used descriptive, subjective language. The moment they moved to commitment, they switched instantly to transactional, conditional language.
And that ability to switch registers, which is the core of pragmatic competence, it allows them to manage leverage and hierarchy.
They used mitigating language to soften their demands, making sure the agent remained cooperative. But they used sharpening language like untenable, provided that, to ensure the outcomes were concrete and legally enforceable.
It's the art of the compromise, but it's wrapped in the formality of linguistic precision. They were able to get a concession on the price.
But only because they reciprocated with a certainty, that extended 18-month term that was then formalized using that high register language, were you to consent.
For you, the listener, applying this knowledge means moving beyond just a passive grammatical understanding and into active strategic deployment.
It's about knowing not just how to structure a sentence, but knowing when to choose the formal, binding provided that over the conversational if, and knowing how to phrase a request so the focus is on the abstract administrative constraint, the figure, rather than the specific emotional relationship with the agent.
This kind of analysis, really looking at the linguistic consequences of your word choices, it's the fastest way to refine your command of the language in these stressful, high-stakes environments.
So we want to leave you with a final challenge, one that's built directly on the strategic lessons we've just discussed. Think back to a recent time you had to negotiate something difficult.
Maybe it was requesting a raise, or challenging a bill, or even just defining a shared commitment with a partner or a friend.
When you made your request, did you focus on your value to the other party, an objective constraint, like the 18-month certainty Jake and Lisa offered?
Or did you focus on your need for the outcome, a subjective need, like needing more money for personal expenses?
And reflect on the language you used. Did you use any of the conditional structures we talked about? Did you link your request to a mandatory prerequisite? By retrospectively analyzing your communication through this lens of mitigating language and conditional structures, you can pinpoint exactly where you gained or lost leverage.
And that ensures you're equipped with maximum linguistic precision for your next high-stakes exchange. We are really eager for you to start applying these rules of engagement. Thank you for lending us your ears and your time for this deep dive into the language of contracts and compromise.
Stay sharp, stay curious, and keep refining your command of the language.
Until next time.